Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 7, 1997, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader. Mr. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the first session of the 105th Congress has been completed and the third year of the conservative revolution has passed. Current congressional leadership has declared victory and is now debating how to spend the excess revenues about to flow into the Treasury. As the legislative year came to a close, the only serious debate was over the extent of the spending increases negotiated into the budget. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Control over the Congress is not seriously threatened, and there has been no clear-cut rejection of the 20th century welfare state. But that does not mean there is no effort to change the direction of the country. It's just that it's not yet in progress. But many taxpayers throughout the country are demanding change, and today there are more people in Washington expressing a sincere desire to shrink the welfare state than there were when I left 13 years ago. The final word on this has not yet been heard. In contemplating what needs to be done and why we haven't done better, we should consider several philosophic infractions in which members of Congress participate that encourage a loss of liberty and endanger our national security and the Republic while perpetuating the status quo. Following are some of the flaws or errors in thinking about issues that I find pervasive throughout the Congress. Foreign affairs. Although foreign affairs was not on the top of the agenda in the last session, misunderstanding in this area presents one of the greatest threats to the future of America. There is near uniformity of opinion in the Congress for endorsing the careless use of U.S. force to police the world. Although foreign policy was infrequently debated in the past year, and there are no major wars going on or likely to start soon, the danger inherent in foreign entanglements warrants close scrutiny. The economy, crime, the environment, drugs, currency instability, and many other problems are important, but it's in the area of foreign policy and foreign interventionism that provokes the greatest threat to our liberties and sovereignty. Whenever there are foreign monsters to slay, regardless of their true threat to us, misplaced patriotic zeal is used to force us to look outward and away from domestic problems and the infractions placed on our personal liberties here at home. Protecting personal liberties in any society is always more difficult during war. The uniformity of opinion in Congress is enshrined with the common cliches that no one thinks through, like foreign policy is bipartisan. Only the president can formulate foreign policy. We must support the troops and therefore, of course, the war, which is usually illegal and unwise but can't be challenged. We are the only world superpower. We must protect our interests like oil. However, it's never admitted, although most know, our policy is designed to promote the military-industrial complex and world government. Most recently, the Congress almost unanimously beat the drums for war, i.e. to kill Hussein. And any consideration of the facts involved elicited charges of anti-patriotism. Yet, in the midst of the clamor to send our planes and bombs to Baghdad, cooler heads were found in of all places, Kuwait. A Kuwaiti professor, amazingly, was quoted in a popular pro-government Kuwaiti newspaper as saying, quote, "The U.S. frightens us with Saddam to make us buy weapons and sign contracts with American companies," close quote, thus ensuring a market for American arms manufacturers and the United States' continued military presence in the Middle East. A Kuwaiti legislator was quoted as saying, quote, "The use of force has ended up strengthening the Iraqi regime rather than weakening it," close quote. Other Kuwaitis have suggested that the U.S. really wants Hussein in power to make sure his weak neighbors fear him and are forced to depend on the United States for survival. In spite of the reservations and reasons to go slow, the only criticism coming from congressional leaders was that Clinton should do more quicker without any serious thought as to the consequences, which would be many. The fact that of the original 35 allies in the Persian Gulf War, only one remains, Great Britain, should make us question our policy in this region. This attitude in Washington should concern all Americans. It makes it too easy for presidents to start a senseless war without considering dollar costs or threat to liberty here and abroad. Even without a major war, this policy enhances the prestige and the influence of the United Nations. These days, not even the United States moves without a permission from the UN Security Council. In checking with the U.S. Air Force about the history of U-2 flights in Iraq, over Iraq, and their current schedules, I was firmly told the Air Force was not in charge of these flights. The UN was. The Air Force has just suggested I call the Defense Department. There is much to be concerned about with our current approach to foreign policy. It's dangerous because it can lead to a senseless war like Vietnam, or small ones with bad results like in Somalia. Individual freedom is always under attack, and once there is any serious confrontation with a foreign enemy, we are all required to rally around the president no matter how flawed the policy. Too often, the consequences are unforeseen, like making Hussein stronger and not weaker after the Persian Gulf War. The role of the military-industrial complex cannot be ignored, and since the marching orders come from the United Nations, the industrial complex is more international than ever. But there is reason to believe the hidden agenda of our foreign policy is less hidden than it had been in the past. In referring to the United States and the international oil company's success in the Caspian Sea, a Houston newspaper recently proclaimed, quote, U.S. views pipelines as a big foreign policy victory, close quote. This referred to the success of major deals made by giant oil companies to build pipelines to carry oil out of the Caspian Sea, while also delivering a strong message that for these projects to be successful and further enhance U.S. foreign policy, it will require government subsidies to help pay the bill. Market developments of the pipelines would be cheaper, but would not satisfy our international government planners, so we must be prepared to pay, as we already have started to, through our foreign aid appropriations. This promotes on a grand scale a government-business partnership that is dangerous to those who love liberty and detest fascism. And yet, most members of Congress will say little, ask little, and understand little, while joining in the emotional outbursts directed toward the local thugs running the Mid-Eastern fiefdoms like Iraq and Libya. This attitude, as pervasive as it is in Washington, is tempered by the people's instincts for minding our own business, not wanting Americans to be the policemen of the world, and deep concern for American sovereignty. The result, not too unusual, is for the politicians in Washington to be doing one thing while saying something else when at home. At home, virtually all citizens condemn U.S. troops serving under UN command, and yet the financing and support for expanding the United Nations and NATO's role continues as the hysteria mounts for marching on Baghdad or Bosnia or Haiti or wherever our leaders decide the next monster is to be found. The large majority of House members claim they want our troops out of Bosnia, yet the president gets all the funding he wants. The members of Congress get credit at home for paying lip service to a U.S. policy of less intervention, while a majority continue to support the troops, the president, the military-industrial complex, and the special interests who drive our foreign policy, demanding more funding while risking the lives, property, peace, and liberty of American citizens. Congress casually passes resolution after resolution, many times nearly unanimously, condemning some injustice in the world, and for the most part there is a true injustice, but along with the caveat that threatens some unconstitutional U.S. military interference, financial assistance or withdrawal of assistance, or sanctions in order to force our will on someone else. And it's all done in the name of promoting the United Nations and one world government. Many resolutions on principle are similar to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which became equivalent to a declaration of war and allowed for the massive loss of life in the Vietnam fiasco. Most members of Congress fail to see the significance of threatening violence against countries like Libya, Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Iraq, Iran, or Haiti. Yet our credibility suffers since our policies can never satisfy both sides of each regional conflict. In the Middle East, even with all our announced intentions and military effort to protect Kuwait, our credibility is questioned as most Arabs still see us as pro-Israel, anti-Arab, and motivated by power, oil, and money. America's effort to prevent 1 million casualties in Rwanda doesn't anywhere compare to our perennial effort to get Hussein. It is hardly violations of borders or the possession of weapons of mass destruction that motivates us to get Hussein or drive our foreign policy. We were allies of Iraq when it used poison gas against the Kurds and crossed the border into Iran. We support the Turks even though they murder Kurds, but we condemn the Iraqis when they do the same thing. There are more than 25,000 Soviet nuclear warheads that cannot be accounted for, and all we hear about from the politicians is about Iraq's control of weapons of mass destruction. Our policy in the Middle East is totally schizophrenic and driven by Arab oil, weapon sales, and Israel. This is especially dangerous because the history of the West's intrusion into the Middle East for 1,000 years in establishing the artificial borders that exist today has created a mindset among Islamic fundamentalists that guarantees that friction will persist in this region no matter how many Husseins or Ayatollahs we kill. That would only make things worse for us. As much as I fear and detest one world government, this chaos that we contribute to in the Middle East assures me that there is no smooth sailing for the New World Order. Rough seas are ahead for all of us. If the UN's plan for their type of order is successful, it will cost American citizens money and freedom. If significant violence breaks out, it will cost American citizens money, freedom, and lives. Yes, I fear a biological and even a nuclear accident, but I see our cities as at a much greater risk because of our policy than if we were neutral and friends with all factions, instead of trying to be a financial and military ally of all factions depending on the circumstances. The way we usually get dragged into a shooting war is by some unpredictable incident where innocent Americans are killed after our government placed them in harm's way and the enemy provoked. Then the argument is made that once hostilities break out, debating the policy that created the mess is off limits. Everybody then must agree to support the troops. But the best way to support our troops and our liberties is to have a policy that avoids unnecessary confrontation. A pro-American constitutional policy of non-intervention would go a long way toward guaranteeing maximum liberty and protection of life and property for all Americans. American interests around the world could best be served by friendship and trade with all who would be friends and subsidies to none. The balanced budget. There's a naive assumption in Washington that the budget is under control and will soon be balanced, while believing perpetual prosperity is here and new programs can now be seriously considered. It reminds me of an old Chinese saying, when words lose their meaning, people lose their liberty. Even the revolutionaries have claimed victory. One of the staunchest members recently declared, in the end, we achieved a balanced budget for the first time since 1969. Medicare and welfare were reformed, all in 3 short years, a truly remarkable record on how far we've come. I can understand a positive spin on events of the last 3 years by party leaders. That's what party leaders do. But the revolutionary members of the 104th Congress should not be taken in easily or quickly. But Washington has a strange way of dulling the senses, and no one enjoys peer rejection or lonely fights where one is depicted as pursuing a fruitless adventure and appearing negative. Capitulating to the status quo is the road of least resistance, and rationalizations are generously offered up. It has been especially tempting for members of Congress to accept the projection of higher revenues as a panacea to our budgetary problems. The prevailing attitude in Washington as 1997 came to a close was that the limited government forces had succeeded. The conservative revolution was won, and now it's time to move on and make government work more efficiently. I'm sure some know better, but the real reason for these declarations of budgetary success is for the sole purpose of maintaining power. Minority leaders find themselves frustrated because they know spending has gone up and the higher tax revenues have helped those in charge. The Republican Congress and the President Clinton benefited, while the Democratic congressional leaders could only ask, why can't more be spent on welfare if the country is doing so well? Fundamental problems like the size of the budget, the deficit, the debt, higher taxes, currency problems, and excessive regulations were put on the back burner, if not ignored altogether. While complacency regarding foreign policy sets the stage for danger overseas, this naive attitude regarding the budget and the deficit is permitting the welfare state to be re-energized and cancel entirely any efforts to reduce the size and scope of government. Under Reagan, as in the early parts of the Republican control of Congress, some signs of deceleration in the growth of government were seen. But even then, there was no pretense made to shrink the size of government, and once again, the path of least resistance has been to capitulate and allow government to grow as it has been for decades.